Big Swole 58 here, and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about something I ran across since I've started collecting these Smith & Wesson revolvers. And I'm sure this probably holds true with any other manufacturer's guns too. And this is kind of centers around uh, making sure that you're buying what's being advertised. And what I mean by that is when you buying these guns, these older revolvers, uh, you're buying them usually from either the previous owner or the original owner or some previous owner that the gun may have changed hands several times. And aside from making sure you're buying a good quality gun, the second thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you're buying what the person is actually advertising the gun to be. Now that's important because if you're buying something that is less valuable than the person is actually advertising, you may be overpaying for a gun that should bring, a much lower market value uh, than a gun that's being incorrectly advertised. And I'm going to use the term incorrectly rather than falsely because I think a lot of times the people who are actually listing these guns or selling them may not know this themselves or some of this stuff themselves. Buying a used handgun, you need to take the same approach as if you're buying a used car. You need to familiarize yourself with what it is that you're looking for or the particular manufacturer, make, and model, and know what features were offered on that gun, and make sure that when you're buying it, you're buying what's being advertised and not buying something that doesn't exist but you not know that. Now on these older Smith & Wesson revolvers, especially some of these K-frame revolvers, Smith & Wesson had several different options for some of the components that came on the revolvers, and I don't know for sure if all of them may garner a different price, but some of them being advertised as rare and highly desirable, and really what they're actually selling isn't. And again, I don't want to make it seem like it's being done intentionally. I think the buyers and the sellers may not always know what they have. So a good example, just on this model. All right, this is a model 66-2. Now I know some of you probably have heard of the 3T gun, the 3T's gun. T's mean target hammer, target trigger, target stocks. And in many cases, if you run across one of those revolvers and it's in pretty good shape, it's usually going to bring a higher price because of the 3T's. Well, if you don't know what it means other than you think you're buying a 3T gun, you need to know the difference between a target hammer and a standard hammer. Now the gun on the left has a standard hammer. The gun on the right has a target hammer. You can see the difference between the hammers. The target hammer has a much wider spur, and the angle is much less on the target hammer than it is on the standard hammer. Now most target pistols are going to, guns with target hammers are usually going to be priced higher than one with a standard hammer. So when you're buying or you're negotiating a price, you need to negotiate the price knowing that someone may advertise a gun as having a target hammer and it has a standard hammer. So when you're negotiating the price, you need to make sure that you and the seller knows that. target trigger. The target trigger, I don't know if it comes in the frame, is much wider than the standard trigger on these older revolvers. It's much wider. They're both serrated. And I think in a lot of cases, people they're assuming that these are target triggers because they're serrated, and they're not. So this gun has a standard hammer and a standard trigger, but it could be easily listed as having a target hammer and target trigger because it has target stocks. And I've seen many of these guns listed as a 3T gun, and the seller, either not knowing this, is demanding a higher price for the revolver, whereas it shouldn't be higher priced because it doesn't have the features as it's being advertised. They may not know they're advertising falsely. Now, another thing, you have the combat trigger and a combat hammer. Now, the one on the right is a combat hammer. The one on the left is a target hammer. As you can see, the spur is not quite as wide on this gun, and the angle is different. But it is wider than the standard or the service hammer that is called a lot of times on the gun on the left. But they have the same spur angle. Now, why is that significant? Again, because a lot of times people are advertising a gun as having a combat hammer and trigger, and they just have the service or the standard hammer and trigger. Combat trigger on Smith & Wesson revolvers were not serrated. They're smooth. And they're slightly wider than the standard trigger. And you know this because it has a little ridge right here. It's slightly wider. So these are just some of the options that when you're buying, especially these used revolvers, that it's definitely helpful to know this information when you're negotiating the price of your guns. Because but maybe not all cases, most cases, used revolvers or used guns in general, the prices are fairly negotiable. But you need to know what you're negotiating and what you're buying in order for it to be fair for the buyer and the seller. Now, another option, probably much less talked about, are the wooden stocks. Now, I've seen a lot of aftermarket stocks on not just Smith & Wesson revolvers, but a lot of revolvers or a lot of semi-automatic handguns, and they're being called factory stocks just because they have a Smith & Wesson logo on them or a Smith & Wesson medallion. And that's not always together the case, because there's lots of grip manufacturers out there that are making Smith & Wesson replica stocks. And they may look like Smith & Wesson stocks, but they're not. And most of them have plastic medallions. Now, there's a few, or maybe one or two companies that don't, but most of the companies do. They have plastic medallions. And if someone's selling a gun that says it's, all factory original components, and it has a pair of aftermarket stocks, and they're passing them off as Smith & Wesson originals because they have a Smith & Wesson logo on them, well, you're going to pay, or that person's going to demand a higher price for that gun than the gun is actually worth based on the information that they're providing. So I guess my whole call out here is if you're buying these used guns, especially some of these older revolvers, you know, it is going to work to your advantage to educate yourself on what you're looking for and knowing what it looks like, because a lot of these sellers, whether it's intentional or unintentional, are listing a lot of these guns with features that the gun just doesn't have, and you're paying premium price for some of these things that you think you're buying and you're not buying them. And I know this because I've looked far and wide for a lot of revolvers that I've ran across and I've bought, and a lot of the ones I just walk away from or don't even attempt to buy because they're not being listed properly, and a lot of times the prices that they're asking for them just aren't worth the gun based on condition and features. A 3T gun is going to bring a much higher price than the same gun that has a standard hammer and a standard trigger, as opposed to one that has a target hammer and a target trigger. And that holds true with 357 Magnum as well as 44 Magnums and 41 Magnums. So, you know, don't overpay for something unless you just want to. Don't overpay for something that you should be able to buy for a much lesser price, and that's strictly based on features. I'm sure whoever owns the gun decides how much or how little they're willing to take for it. But make sure that you know what you're negotiating for before you start negotiating the price, or make sure you know what you're spending your money on is worth what you're buying it for, because a lot of these things are not being advertised correctly, and it's easy to see and easy to mistake one type of trigger for another type of trigger, or one type of hammer for another type of hammer, or one type of wooden stock for another type, if you don't know for certain. And especially on model 686s, where you see a lot of these guns being advertised and they're saying that they have period correct wooden stocks on them. They have the factory original wooden stocks on them, and they're extractor cutout stocks. It doesn't matter that much, but if you're a person who wants to collect for and have, you know, period correct items, and what you think you're getting is a factory original item, Smith 686s were never issued with extractor cutout stocks. They all came with speed loader cutout stocks. So when it comes down to things like that, please, you save yourself a lot of money and some disappointment if you just educate yourself a little bit and know what you're buying and know what you're negotiating your prices for, and you could probably save yourself a lot of money in the process. And this Smith & Wesson standards catalog is an extremely good catalog. It gives you way more information than you're ever going to need to know about Smith & Wesson handguns. But even the material in this book may conflict somewhat from category to category. And don't just use one means of information to determine all that you know. You know, there's all kinds of forums online, and you can Google almost anything and find out information. But read all you can, do all you can. When it comes down to these Smith & Wesson revolvers, that's what I rely on. And I've been able to, like I said, save myself a lot of money when it comes down to negotiating prices on guns that in a few cases were incorrectly advertised. And then once you bring it to to the knowledge of the seller, sometimes they're a lot more flexible on their pricing because they may have advertised a gun to be one thing and it turned out to be something else. Well, listen, that's all I have for now. I hope that was informative, and I hope you heard something today that you may use in your future when you're going out trying to find some of these guns or any gun. As always, I enjoy your comments. Don't mind your criticisms. As long as they're constructive, that's how I learn, grow, and improve. That's all I have for now. So until the next time, this is Big Swole 58 signing off.